Welcome and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gokul Plaha, and I am a consultant with the GUTS Institute for Regulation and Competition, or CIRC. I am delighted to have Ms. Zita Vasas as our guest speaker for today's webinar, titled, Is the Rationale Behind Ex-Ante Regulation in the Digital Economy Flawed? Amongst the audience, we have distinguished competition law and policy experts, antitrust lawyers, antitrust enthusiasts, and students. I want to take a moment to personally thank each and every participant for showing up to this discussion. The CIRC strives to be at the forefront of exploring regulatory and policy issues relating to the fields of law, economics, and public policy. Let me now talk about our guest, Ms. Zita Vasas, who I shall refer to as Zita. Zita is a competition economist, vice president at Compass Lexicon. A consulting firm, Compass Lexicon provides law firms, corporations, and governments with analysis on complex economic and financial matters. According to a 2021 article on the highly regarded news portal Quartz, Compass Lexicon is amongst the world's top antitrust consulting firms. Zita has previously worked with Hungary's National Competition Authority and as a member in the competition team of the UK's Financial Conduct Authority. She has also been a competition policy consultant. In a career that has spanned over a decade, she handled cases in sectors as wide-ranging as retail, finance, FMCG, healthcare, and telecommunications. Those cases related to an equally diverse set of jurisdictions: the European Union, the United Kingdom, South Africa, Oman, and India. She gained expertise in, among other things, helping conduct market investigations, investigating abuse of dominance cases, and advising on mergers and acquisitions cases. Zita completed her PhD in competition policy in 2022 from the UK's University of East Anglia. She holds an MSc in competition and market regulation from Spain's Barcelona School of Economics. Here's where I would want to turn the audience's attention to the law and policy context for this colloquy. Today, competition law and policy find themselves at a crossroads. Arguably, the new consensus in antitrust academia across the world is that traditional competition law enforcement doesn't adequately capture, much less remedy, the novel harms emanating from the digital economy. That's because the economics of digital markets from the economics of traditional markets. In a report titled Anti-Competitive Practices by Big Tech Companies, the Standing Committee on Finance of India's lower house of parliament states that digital markets are characterized by, quote, massively powerful increasing return to size economies, unquote. Those increasing returns, the report goes on to state, quote, result not just from traditional scale and scope effects, but also dramatically powerful learning and network effects. As a consequence, digital markets lack the kind of fairness and contestability one can find in traditional markets. Some of the ostensibly, and I stress the word ostensibly here, novel harms flowing from these peculiar market dynamics are killer acquisitions, anti-steering provisions, algorithmic self-preferencing, anti-competitive data-related practices, search bias, etc. Not just India, but jurisdictions around the world are deliberating whether antitrust law in the digital realm needs a complete overhaul. The European Union and Germany have devised ex-ante legislations that place multiple restrictions and obligations on the conduct of digital behemoths. And the United Kingdom has come up with a draft bill. Countries around the world either have or are in the process of studying their digital markets, including India, South Africa, Australia, Japan, and the United States. It is against this backdrop that Zita will share her views on whether traditional ex-post competition law enforcement can tackle the novel harms that supposedly emanate from the digital economy. In doing so, she will also share her views on the economics of digital markets. Relatedly, she will discuss the precise problems that ex-ante regulation aims to remedy. The other broad theme of her presentation will concern the regulatory challenges that go along with designing and implementing a regulatory initiative of the scale, size, and scope of ex-ante regulation in digital markets. Rather than answer questions, Zita seeks to pique the minds of the audience by raising pertinent questions about such challenges. That means by the end of this webinar, attendees will have plenty of food for thought. Next, Zita will discuss the importance of generating and harnessing expertise to confront and effectively tackle the challenges on the regulatory front. The third big theme of Zita's presentation will be about the quote-unquote lessons that developing countries like India can take from scholarship and regulatory experiences from other parts of the world. In this context, Zita will discuss the importance of international regulatory coherence as well as tailoring regulation to a country's specific circumstances. Zita will hold the floor for 20 minutes. After that, she will engage in a free-flowing discussion with the audience. Over to you, Zita.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Gokul. So let's skip the screen and let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Great. So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to give a presentation on this really fascinating topic. I'm very pleased to be here and speaking to you, although not in person, just here online. And I look forward to hearing the views of the participants on this topic during our discussion. As I understand, there is a lively debate in India about the idea of introducing legislation similar to the Act, covering the specificities of it, including how, the who, and the when to regulate questions. I hope that my presentation can contribute to this debate and provides you with a useful overview of where we are in this journey in Europe, and maybe some lessons on what you could take from it. So as Gokul has already set out, I was asked to cover 3 questions in my presentation. The first question is about the economic rationale for ex-ante regulation of digital platforms, and in particular, whether there is a difference between digital and more traditional markets, a difference that would justify the differential treatment. I will also cover the arguments on why antitrust policy appears to be insufficient to address the concerns that have arisen. The second topic is about the challenges associated with implementing a legislative change initiative like the DMA. So, as Gokul said, I will talk about the importance of setting clear aims for the regulation, which includes being clear about the relationship between the new ex-ante regulation and the existing ex-post competition laws, as well as other laws. I'll cover some of the key regulatory design choices and the pros and cons of different approaches, and finally touch upon the expertise that a newly established regulatory body or regulatory unit may wish to have in-house. Thirdly, I'll present my views on what lessons countries that are currently thinking about introducing legislation can be primarily in Europe. So my presentation draws heavily on the work of Professor Emilia Fletcher, who, for those of you who don't know her, is a very influential person in the UK and in Europe in competition policy circles. She was the chief economist of the UK's competition authority for many years, and she's the co-author of the Furman Report, which recommended to the UK government to introduce legislation of large digital platforms. And she also happened to be my PhD supervisor. And we are currently working together on a research project that focuses on the role of behavioral insights in the implementation of the DMA. That is not the focus of today's talk, but I will touch upon it briefly as it is relevant to the questions that we are discussing and in my view, quite critical in achieving the aims of such regulations. I would also like to add that I am currently working on a project which involves large digital platforms, but I am unfortunately unable to discuss anything in relation to this due to confidentiality requirements. So let's get started. Please feel free to ask questions during the presentation as well, but we can cover them at the end during the discussion as well. So I think when we talk about digital markets and digital platforms, the starting point is to acknowledge the benefits that these platforms have brought to us, because there are indeed huge benefits from these global ecosystems that the platforms created, including providing high quality services to consumers for free or at very low prices, or providing access to global markets and to enhance logistics to the firms themselves, as well as incentives to innovate to startups, because there is the possibility that they can sell their business to the large platforms. So it is no doubt a fact that we have benefited hugely from the work of these platforms. However, we also observe outcomes that include highly concentrated markets, exhibiting high barriers to entry, an accumulation of market power, and not only market power, but power beyond economic power, and control over access to data, users, and infrastructure. Now, in this presentation, I will focus on the economic power and the market power and stay away from political considerations. Question is, why is this happening, and whether this is a cause for concern, given that market power in itself, of course, is not an issue without an abuse according to traditional competition law. So why do we think that there is a problem here? The market power in itself is not a problem. Now, let's take a step back and think about why we observe these outcomes. It is now treated pretty much as common grounds that these outcomes are at least partly driven by inherent characteristics of these digital markets, and I'm sure you have heard about these arguments. There are huge economies of scale and scope. There are within platform and ecosystem-wide network effects, and there are data feedback loops. The more data you have, the better service you can provide. And there is also an additional issue, which is not necessarily specific to digital markets, larger consequences in these markets. And this is the cognitive limitations of end users. So many of us are not tech experts, and we have limited time and, in fact, limited appetite to understand how these services operate. And we just want them to be simple and intuitive to use. And this really has implications on what digital platforms can achieve. So the first point to make here is that digital markets exhibit some characteristics that market forces and competition may not sort out without help. So the second point is that such large market power obviously brings various risks of harm. Platforms could abuse this market power by exploiting business users and end users, charging higher prices to business users and reducing quality to end users, for example. They can also use their power to exclude smaller competitors, for example, by leveraging market power to adjacent markets. Of course, the theoretical possibility is not sufficient and to justify regulation, but we observe more and more cases brought on both by competition authorities as well as business users that allege that the platforms did abuse their power. And some of these cases do conclude that indeed there was an abuse. So I understand that, for instance, the Competition Commission of India fined Google in 2022 for over $160 million for leveraging its dominant position in markets such as online search and app distribution to protect its apps like Chrome and YouTube. So we do observe some issues around this. Now, one additional harm that I would like to mention is the dynamic harm to competition, which we hear more and more about. And this is basically a concern related to markets that haven't even been born. So the idea here is that in the digital world, but also in some other markets like pharmaceuticals, firms compete not only on price and quality and innovation, but also on creating new markets, new products. And we all know that these are very fast-moving markets, and they can emerge relatively quickly, and there is enormous growth potential in successful ideas. So I believe Google is only like 25 years old, really. So this theory of harm deals with the elimination of competitors that could present a risk, a threat to the existing digital ecosystems by creating a different offering that kind of shakes the balance. And this has, of course, been mostly relevant in merger control, which is a forward-looking framework. And so these are the risks that I wanted to mention. And then that leads us to the question, is competition law suitable to mitigate these risks? Why do we need regulation? Why isn't what we already have sufficient? And so on the next slide, I would like to set out, I try to collect the reasons why ex-post competition law and merger control may not be sufficient to address these risks. The first one is that, as I already mentioned, some of these key drivers are inherent in digital markets. So you can't expect competition to do its job. And so we need proactive intervention to promote competition. The second is that these ecosystems rely on different business models, and there are a variety of different specific issues. So if you bring on a case, a competition case, and then there is a decision that can provide guidance or deterrent effect, that is going to be relatively specific to that issue and might not be sufficient to provide guidance on other issues related that are also relevant on digital markets. So you would need really a large number of cases brought on relatively quickly to have guidance that the regulation can provide in one legislation. Another issue is that appropriate remedies require monitoring. So often the remedies that you can come up with at the end of a competition case are such that the competition authority needs to check whether the implementation is properly done and whether it has an impact. And in fact, this is regulation in itself anyway. And that is one other reason why we think that, why many people think that ex-post competition law is insufficient. I also mentioned the dynamic theories of harm, which leads us to merger control. There are a large number of acquisitions by these firms, by digital platforms. And as I mentioned already, this is good in many ways for new and small businesses, but it can bring some harms. And we have only seen very few merger control interventions in this sphere. And I would also like to note that while this dynamic theory of harm is very exciting and interesting, I imagine this is extremely hard to block a merger on that basis, that there will be harm on a market that hasn't even. And for that reason, there are also concerns about whether merger control can prevent harms occurring in these markets. And I left the most common argument as the last point, which is that antitrust cases just take too long, which is not suited for these fast-moving markets that are prone to tipping. And I would pause here for just 1 second about why these cases are long. And one thing to highlight is that competition law is such that we need to define markets, we need to show market power, and in several cases we need to show the effect, or at least that there was a likely effect, which all involves legal argumentation as well as complicated economic analysis. And so I can say this as an economist. I think one of the reasons why these cases are long is because we are required, and the authority and the firms are required to show with economic tools that there is a relevant market. This is the boundary of the relevant market. There is market power. There is an effect, and that takes a long time and can, of course, be challenged as well. So the question is, how is ex-ante regulation trying to get around these issues? And here, I would just like to run through that. I think it's very important that we set clear aims for ex-ante regulation. Do we want to proactively open up markets to competition, or do we just want to prevent harms occurring in further markets, or do we want to do both? Can we provide this upfront framework that will give guidance to large platforms and rivals? Is this us closer towards a level playing field? And separately, is this quick enough? Can we make it quick enough? Is that a stated aim to be quicker than antitrust? And also, it's important to be clear that regulation is meant to complement rather than substitute antitrust. We wouldn't want to abandon any competition or all competition cases in antitrust, but we do want to complement it with regulation. So overall, I think a clear aim is important, and it's important to set out that we want to help smaller businesses to be able to compete so that they can bring on the benefits of competition into these markets. But there are lots of different questions that a regulator, sorry, I didn't switch the slide, that a regulator needs to address, and we'll move on to that for now. So these are the design choices, and as Gokul mentioned, I will speak first about I will speak mostly about questions rather than answers, because I do not know the answers. One of the key questions is whether we want to set standard, or the regulator wants to set standard or more bespoke rules. As I already mentioned, ecosystems have different business models, even when they provide similar services. And there is a risk that a high-level rule will not be suitable for all firms or services. But on the other hand, developing bespoke rules and also implementing and monitoring bespoke rules is much more time-consuming, so you need a bigger regulatory unit. The second question is to what extent the regulation should be fixed. Again, these are new markets, they move fast, so regulations could become outdated and inappropriate quite quickly. And it is also possible that these new instruments, regulatory instruments, prove ineffective, which means the need for revisions. However, if we have highly flexible rules that will provide less certainty, and changing the regulation frequently is also quite resource intensive. Another question is which firms to regulate. So we have quantitative or qualitative criteria for firms to be in scope. The quantitative thresholds provide clarity, and they are quicker to establish and to apply. However, qualitative criteria is more suitable for specific or new situations to establish whether the regulation should apply firm or not. Another question to decide for the regulator is whether we require firms to demonstrate, or whether we want regulators to assess compliance. Requiring firms to demonstrate compliance themselves may mean that we only need a smaller regulatory unit. However, platforms would obviously have incentives to gain the compliance reports and demonstrate their best numbers, and that could have some unintended consequences on their behavior. So these are some questions, and I will now run through how the EU's DMA is dealing with these in practice. So I believe that the DMA is a set of relatively specific rules, but it also has a general anti-avoidance provision. So it sets out that this, you need to do or you are not supposed to do. But then there is a rule that says we have the objectives of contestability and fairness, and you have to apply everything in a way that you meet these objectives. So just because a firm can explain why a specific provision is not relevant for them, they still need to act in a way that the overall objectives of the DMA would be achieved. The EU gave an explicit allowance for revisions, and as I understand, they are aiming for an iterative process with the firms themselves. They set quantitative criteria on who should be in scope, but this can be challenged on a qualitative basis, both by the firms and the authority itself. And it is the firms who are required to demonstrate their compliance, but the EC is preparing a template, a compliance report template, and is consulting on what should go into that template. Now, next I would like to cover what kind of expertise is required within a regulatory unit. Obviously, the regulators must build a team with the necessary expertise. And I think this is a bit broader now than it used to be for classic competition authorities. We obviously need legal lawyers who can interpret and apply the rules. But we will also need people who understand what the platforms are saying, the technical feasibility, the technical arguments, and can interpret and respond to these and basically translate these technical arguments to the policy people. And this could potentially include AI experts. We need behavioral scientists who can assess whether there are any behavioral insights that alter or inhibit effective implementation of the rules. And there is a question of whether we need economists, because the big difference between the DMA and the competition law, the existing competition law, is that we don't require, the regulations don't really give explicit space for economists to come in with loads of analysis. They assume the effect. You don't need to prove it. You don't need to prove that the conduct has any harmful effect. But there is still scope for economists to add value. And Amelia Fletcher has a separate paper on it, which I encourage everyone to look at in terms of what benefits, what useful roles economists could have. But most importantly, what I would like to highlight is that the regulatory unit will have to cooperate and hands with these large platforms. Otherwise, the regulations could go all in waste. So you need to have people who can engage the people in platforms. Next, I put out where we are in the EU with the DMA, but I'll skip this in the interest of time. We can come back to it if people are interested. In terms of the third topic then, what I would like to cover is what kind of lessons we can take from this brief overview. So firstly, the existing regulations are still too new to draw substantive lessons, but can be used as a starting point for introducing new legislation and can certainly inform on key decision points. I think there are huge benefits of international regulatory coherence. So smaller regulatory and technical costs for the platforms, less focus on compliance, also more certainty for smaller rivals who could compete on an international level. But it is also true that regulations must fit a particular country's circumstances, and that includes legal, political, cultural perspectives. So just implementing what's been done elsewhere may not necessarily be a good idea. Another argument to consider that these digital platforms operate on a global basis, and they may implement rules that are set in one region they may implement these rules globally, making national regulation, in particular in certain areas, redundant. So think about interoperability. It might be hard to be interoperable, to provide interoperability with three, but not in the other one. And there is a further risk that one might want to consider about the potential risks of regulation in countries where the rent on particular markets is a bit smaller. If regulation is introduced, platforms might pull out certain services or delay the introduction of innovations if the regulation increases their costs to a level where it is not really worth the investment anymore. So just to conclude, is ex-ante regulation of digital platforms justified? In my view, yes. Should all countries adopt the same legislation right now? I'm less sure. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand it back to Gokul to lead the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation, Zita. It was very easy to understand, concise and precise. We will now open the floor to questions from the audience. Please go ahead. You can type your questions in the chat box. Alternatively, you can raise your hand, or you can simply switch on your camera and ask the question upfront.
So I see one question already in the chat, which is about how is harm determined in the digital market for ex-ante regulations. So my understanding is that, for example, on the DMA, there is quite a lot of economic thinking that went into the regulations themselves. They relied on past cases, past theories of harms that, for example, on self-preferencing, there are provisions on how these digital platforms are not supposed to self-preference. There is a provision how you're supposed to show choice screens to allow consumers to make their choices in particular situations. And as I said, the regulation does not require the firms or the authority to prove that there is harm occurring from these conducts. But the presumption of the regulation, the underlying basis of the regulation, is the past cases and past academic research that shows that these behaviors can indeed lead to harm and can indeed lead to market outcomes where the digital platform strengthens its power.
Right. Thank you for that answer. Can I please request that questions are said to everybody and not exclusively our guest speaker? Can we just know who asked this question, the first question?
Mrilani Srivastava. Apologies if I don't pronounce the name correctly.
Yes, I would request that the question please be put in the chat box. Thank you. Other questions, please?
While people are still getting ready to ask questions, Zita, I want to ask you that you have laid down the menu of issues very clearly in terms of the peculiar problems digital markets face and the kind of economic thinking or the structural thinking or the experience of treating these market abuses through the ex post facto law you have captured. But I was looking forward to some mention of the positive effects or benefits, if any, these platforms bring. For instance, one thing which comes to my mind, let me situate this question in the Indian context. So the markets are very unorganized. There is a large informal economy. There is a prevalence of micro enterprises. And therefore, when they seek to access the markets, there might be positive effects, if not externalities, on the market access front of such micro enterprises, which otherwise would be massively difficult for these people. I'm talking of really ultra micro enterprises where some poor women coming together and doing some printing business and trying to access market. I mean, imagine in the western desert district of India, how difficult it would be to access the Indian market, forget about international markets. But that some of these players might make it possible. Now, what happens? So that's one side of the welfare dividend some of these players might be able to deliver. Whether they are delivering, I have no numbers, so I'm not quoting them, but I'm conceptually speaking. Similarly, access to international markets could be one area where, I mean, we know in a developing country context, the export documentation and the process itself can be so frustrating that small players may be never able to export unless you really have deep pockets to meet with the standards or the of a big country. Now, I mean, having said this, how likely are the ex-ante regulations in any form to disrupt this kind of benefits, if any? Have you ever thought about it? So that this question is particularly from the developing country, emerging economy perspective. The same situation may not exist in Europe, honestly. But when a country like India or Kenya or South Africa or Malaysia seeks to impose something like this, what are the peculiarities and how can these countries figure out the design of the ex-ante law? I'm sorry for this slightly long question, but I needed to set the context. Thank you.
That makes perfect sense, and thank you for the question. Let me highlight the bits of my presentation that I think are informative in this respect. So I started with saying that these platforms have brought huge benefits to us. And as you point out, this implies to small businesses, and in particular in developing countries. I understand that the logistics that they have, that these platforms, for example, can offer, is an immense help to people and to small businesses to reach consumers and to grow. So I fully acknowledge that benefit. Now, the regulations, the DMA and other regulations, are meant to protect these users. These business users, the idea of the regulation is exactly not to make their life difficult, but to make sure that the large platforms deal with them in a fair way and give them a way that allows them to grow, that allows them to challenge, that allows them to compete. So if the regulation is properly designed, these small businesses should not be hurt. However, as on my last slide I mentioned, there are risks of platforms reacting in a way to the regulation that may not be beneficial in a developing country and to the businesses in a developing country. So again, if the regulation is too costly for these small businesses, the platform might just pull out. I mean, India is a big country, so I imagine that even if the rent that the platform can earn is small, given the size, it might still not be an issue for them that they would want to pull out. But the regulations are costly, and if it's such a cost for the platform that it decides to delay innovations, not to offer services, that could indeed cause some issues for the smaller businesses. But again, if the regulation is designed properly, it is in the first place meant to protect these small business users.
I have a follow-up question again on the very, very academic side of the question. When we are saying there is a need of a regulation are we concluding that this market failure cannot be addressed by a market-based mechanism or market-based instrument? So therefore, ex-ante regulation is now the fait accompli. That's something which has to be. There are some bright sparks, even though may not be successful and concluded experiments, but are there some hopes? Are there some streaks which give us a hope that some market-based solutions might obviate the need of ex-ante regulation? Because as you yourself said, that Europe has just started this experiment. The results will come in some time. But in the meantime, can we also experiment with some market-based instruments, market-based solutions, which may reveal some fresh sources of remedy to address this sticky market power problem?
Are these market-based solutions you refer to, are they purely market-based, or are they initiated by the government? So are they, is there a state role in these? So is the idea that instead of introducing regulation, you would want to open up markets by offering some opportunities to the small businesses?
Let me exemplify, Zita, what I mentioned. Let's take an example of payments markets. I mean, I'm pretty sure by virtue of your professional experience, at some stage of your life, you must have taken a look at the payments market of Europe and payments market of United States. And now India is offering a fresh perspective, in the sense the kind of digital payments are happening in India. And that has been made possible because some government and some banks and some other people came together and set up a digital public infrastructure called NPCI, Corporation of India. And that made it possible for variety of senders and receivers to really connect with each other. And of course, the mobile phone and the cell phone and internet, all that made it possible, definitely yes. But a critical gap was funded and facilitated, for the sake of simplicity, I can say, by the government. But the government intervention did not lead to regulation, did not lead to essentially capture by a government entity. So they basically remedied a limited part of the market problem, and then the market is back on its own feet and it's running. So that's one example. There is another experiment in making called ONDC, again in India, which is like an open architecture where all the sellers and buyers can conduct their operations, and all the players basically. And this is basically an e-commerce marketplace, but it has no axe to grind, and it is trying to create an alternative model. So I can give two examples where market-based instrument initiated by the government, but not necessarily government actively playing in the market. Government is only acting in a very limited fashion, only to remedy the market failure, and then allowing the market to pick up its own thread. That's the kind of model I am referring to. Does that make sense for the context we're discussing here?
Yes, thank you. My understanding that these initiatives could exist together with digital platforms having massive power. I understand that you might be able to remedy the issues in a small part of the digital ecosystems, but I don't think it would bring in major changes, such major changes as the regulation. Now, you might not want to bring in those major changes, but I don't think that the impact of the two in terms of impact on the digital platforms would be the same. It is whether the impact is similar, not on the small businesses, that's one question, but the digital platforms, I think, would be would face a higher constraint as a result of regulations, rather than initiatives like that. But again, I don't dispute that the specificities of a market, of a country, and the timing might be questionable when and how you want to introduce regulation. I can see that there are some other questions in the chat. Shall I move on to that?
Yes. Yeah, Zita, we have a number of questions for you. I will start with the first question that I received from Mr. Isaac Chawa. If I'm pronouncing his name wrong, I would request Mr. Isaac to please feel free to ask your question on camera, sir. In the alternative, I'll just share his question. I will just
I had asked the question.
Yeah, please, sir.
Okay, thank you. Hello, thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask the question. So Zita, I was asking, thank you also for hosting this. I was asking the question of, in the DMA, you do not get to see the exemptions, like in the DMCC bill here in the UK, where we have some form of countervailing benefits exemption, which you'd think in the wording, it sounds more like a efficiency defense, if I'm not wrong. So what would be your theory or your understanding as to why the DMA and the DMCC bill took quite a different approach to the exemptions?
Well, I think there are two main issues, two main differences between the EU and the UK, but I have to admit that I'm more familiar with the DMA. The UK is trying to become a bit more specific and allow for more flexibility, whereas the EU is a little bit less flexible, a bit more generic. Still relatively flexible, but less specific than the UK. And therefore, I think the EU is very much concerned about the length of the cases. And as soon as you introduce exceptions, there is the opportunity to challenge on that basis. And you could end up with where we are with ex-post competition law. I do not know this is just speculation, but I would imagine that the EU's reason for not specifying exemptions like that would be that. Although the EU does say that there are a few provisions where they say that safety considerations can be taken into account and can be reasons to justify something.
Thank you. It comes down to technicalities in handling the cases. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for your question, and thank you, Rosita, for your answer. The next question I have received from Mr. Macor Wilson. Mr. Wilson works with the Competition Authority in Kenya. We're privileged to have him with us here today. I would request Mr. Wilson to please ask his question on camera. So please. In the alternative, I will. Okay. Yeah, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. I can still ask my question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. And my question was like this: I'm more concerned about the application of the Digital Markets Act, and also consider the EU competition rules in existence. And when I look at the Digital Markets Act, it's going to be operational as from 6th of March 2024. So my concern is, if, for example, the cases under the competition law, as well as the cases under the Digital Markets Act concerning same services are simultaneously continued, does it not risk double punishment, especially when it comes to making a determination on such kind of the matters? Maybe you can elaborate more on that, because I'm thinking of a situation where we're coming from Africa and we're also working on developing that kind of a thing to regulate our digital market. So we may have to at least have a clear understanding how best we can also structure our digital markets acts to ensure that at least they comply and they also be operational alongside our competition laws in existence. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So I think the answer lies in the different nature of these two laws. Competition cases are backward-looking, whereas the regulation is forward-looking. So I think it is possible to have the two investigations. You will be looking at what happened in the past when the regulation was not in place yet. And once you have the regulation in place, you can look at, well, when you are designing the regulation, you can look at what you want to achieve. And then you can assess that once the regulation has been put in place, whether the firms are complied or not. So I do think that the two can exist in parallel. It is and the governments should be able, the authorities should be able to design regulations while they are running parallel cases, subject to resource constraints, of course. And one further thing to mention is that in regulated markets, such as the telecommunications, for example, even though they are regulated, you can still have competition cases. So even on a market with price regulation, you could have an excessive pricing case, technically. So I think these two should complement each other rather than knock each other out. I wouldn't call the regulation punishment necessarily, and my understanding is that if the DMA doesn't reach the desired effects, punishment for non-compliance might not be the first thing to which the EU goes. To instead, they iteratively improve the regulations. Obviously, it depends on whether the lack of result is due to non-compliance or due to the fact that the regulations were just not properly designed, or properly designed, but for whatever reason they can't reach the desired outcomes. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. You have been very elaborate, and I'm grateful for your response.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, Zita, is from Rationale Srivastava, who works with the CIRC. I would request Ms. Srivastava to ask a question directly on capital, if she wants to. Otherwise, I can just read the question. Okay, I think I'll just read the question out loud. Ms. Srivastava has written, I quote, "The digital market is not restricted to one jurisdiction, and its impact will affect many jurisdictions at a time. In this scenario, how does the DMA work?" Zita,
Well, the DMA cannot apply globally. I think the DMA is about European consumers, just like every other European law. But it is true that these digital platforms are providing services on a global basis. And it is yet to be seen whether the requirements of the DMA will have an impact in other geographies or not. It is up to the firms to decide whether, if they have to make a change, will they do that globally, or will they do that? Will they fragment the markets and offer different things? I imagine that in practice, that can be quite difficult in certain cases. So their whole closed ecosystem, if it is broken up in the EU and they have to let some other services in, question whether they will be able to run two parallel business models. One together with continuing with the closed model, in other jurisdictions, and one which is a slightly open model in the EU. I don't know the answer, how they will react and what they can do. I mean, there is not by chance that they fought against these regulations, because they are massive changes to their business model.
Right. It's 4:27 on the clock. I will just ask one more question from Shweta. Shweta, would you want to ask your question on camera? Ms. Shweta, would you want to ask your question on camera?
Thank you, Gokul. I hope I'm audible. Yeah.
Yes.
Ms. Zita, it's a pleasure to have you. Actually, we have a lot of information on this now. Thank you so much for sharing this. I have one question that how can we measure the success of an ex-ante law? Do you have any? Can you share some of the important success indicators on this?
Well, that's a super exciting question. And I think also $1 million question. So this is one of the things on which the European Commission has recently consulted. What should we put in the compliance report? What is the success? How can you achieve success? I think at a very high level, success would be if we observed more competition in many of these markets. But how you measure that is a very different question. My big concern is that if you look at market shares, for example, let's look at market shares in search or app distribution or browsers. The market shares of the current large digital platforms are huge. And let's say there is a 1% share of a smaller competitor, or 2%. If that increases to 4%, that's 100% increase. That's success, right? But then at the same time, the dynamics of the market haven't changed. Like, I wouldn't say that that's a massive success. You haven't changed anything substantively. So I think what you would want to see is more competition, but not more competition in terms of specific indicators growing by X%, X percentage points or X%. What you would want to see, for instance, is that in markets that are developing yet, they don't tip so easily, or if that is possible, or they tip towards a new competitor. So think about voice assistants, for example. This is still a growing market. Not everyone uses voice assistants. Many people have Alexa using, Apple's voice assistant. But there might be scope for the regulations to give the opportunity for new providers to go in and compete. My personal view is that there might be a bigger hope for the regulations to shake markets up in these new markets where it's not so established. Like, for search to Google is now a verb. That is going to be very difficult to change. And Alexa as the voice assistant is coming there, but it's not quite there. And there might be new markets emerging where the hope is that the regulations, the requirements of the firms that are the gatekeepers to these services will mean that new players will have better chances. In practice, what might happen is that the big digital platforms step into each other's territories and not the small firms, but that is yet to be seen.
Thank you so much, Ms. Zita. I wish we could elaborate more on this and we can discuss more, but as Gokul said that we are running out of time. So thank you so much for this time.
Thank you, Ms. Shweta, for asking your question. It's 4:31 on the clock. I'll just quickly summarize the discussion. Last part of our seminar. I'm sure Zita is also running late, and I'll just try and wind it up as soon as possible. Zita started with talking about how there's been a lively debate in India just like other jurisdictions, about the desirability of ex-ante regulation. The idea really, the main sort of the thrust of her discussion, she said, would be about to talk about where Europe and other developed economies are in their journey as far as ex-ante regulation is concerned, and then discuss some possible lessons that developing economies like India can derive for themselves. She kind of laid out those three themes with that thrust really with in the form of three questions. So first, why ex-ante regulation? Second, what are the challenges? And C, lessons for India and other countries. She's her slides told us that it's important to acknowledge the benefits that these platforms bring, but there are also some downsides like highly concentrated digital markets, accumulation of market power, control over access, data, users, infrastructure, whatnot. And these market dynamics really result in a lot of problems, global economies of scale and scope with network effects and indirect network effects that kind of concentrate market power within platform and ecosystem-wide network effects, data feedback loops, cognitive limitations of end users, etc. Various risks of harms, including platforms, exploiting market powers, excluding competitors, market exclusion, exploitation of market power, which is in ex-post lingo called abuse of dominance. The next slide was really about issues with ex-post competition law and merger control, the drivers inherent in the markets, the need for proactive intervention, specific issues which require broader guidance or deterrent effect in the form of regulation. Appropriate remedies also require monitoring, and large numbers of acquisitions that also need to be tackled with interventions in the realm of merger control. Antitrust cases, of course, take too long. A very important underlying rationale behind ex-ante regulation, and therefore ex-post competition enforcement is perhaps not really suitable for fast-moving markets that are prone to what is known as tipping. A highlight for me was, when Zita posed these questions: do we want to open up markets or mitigate harms, or both? What really is ex-ante regulation seeking to do? And is the remedy of ex-ante regulation really the right intervention? And how do you make sense of that? And she also said that it's important to note that ex-ante regulation cannot be a substitute for ex-post regulation. It can only complement ex-post regulation. So ex-post regulation should go on as it is going on in her view. The second large really theme that she talked about was regulatory challenges and the design the question of design choices that face jurisdictions. So standard or bespoke rules, ecosystems with different business models may require different kinds of rules. There is a risk that high-level rules will not be suitable for all forms and services. And then questions about fixed or flexible regulation, fast-moving on new markets, and all that. She then discussed the EU's DMA in some detail about how relatively specific rules, but it has some general anti-avoidance provisions. It allows for revision, aiming for an iterative process. That's the term she used. Quantitative, but also can be challenged on a qualitative basis. So it provides for quantitative thresholds, also qualitative thresholds. That's how the Commission really desires to proceed with enforcement. A very important element, a very important factor that jurisdictions around the world will have to consider is really the compelling need to generate and harness, as I put in my introductory remarks, expertise. And different kinds of expertise for such a regime: legal, behavioral, AI and tech, and other kinds of economists, of course, because economics may also have a role, will also play an important role. Something that people that economists around the world are currently debating will have an important role to play. The other slides were, of course, about lessons for countries that developing countries. Existing regulations, Zita said, are still too new to draw substantive lessons, but they can be used as they make for a good starting point for introducing a new legislation and a new regulatory regime. International regulatory coherence, of course, has immense benefits, but it's also important to understand that regulation must fit a country's specific circumstances. That includes the legal context, the political context, the cultural context, and the various perspectives on these three. Of course, a potential of risk of regulation in countries where there is a risk, as Zita said, that companies may pull out if the opportunity of rent goes down. But she said for a country as large as India, for an economy as large as India, that may not be a serious issue. We had several questions. Those questions were about how harm should be determined, as Nalini asked, and Zita rightly said that there are various kind of practices that these two legislations really place sanctions on or take note of, like self-preferencing, behavioral things like behavioral remedies like choice screens, etc. And ex-ante regulation really bypasses the need to demonstrate effects, this anti-competitive effects, and so in that sense is more forward-looking. The second question was about the benefits that these platforms bring, and whether regulatory design must exercise caution. Regulators must exercise, or policymakers must exercise caution while designing regulation to make sure that the benefits that these platforms bring, for instance, to small enterprises in remote villages and remote corners of a still developing country like India, are harnessed and are not interfered with. And that's exact, as Zita said, the DMA actually keeps that in mind. It seeks to make sure that that doesn't happen, and it's meant to kind of protect the small guy, if I could use those terms. The third question was, of course, about can this Mr. Navneet Sharma asked whether we can deal with these challenges, the challenges that currently characterize digital markets with a market mechanism, for instance, in India, the NPCI has set up a digital connect stakeholders in the recurring payment space, and that, as Mr. Sharma put it, tackling one particular aspect of the digital market was made sure that the markets were up and running. A similar initiative is the ONDC, which tries to kind of do a similar thing in the e-commerce space. But Zita, in her view, she said that may not be really suitable for a digital market context. They cannot really substitute for effective ex-ante regulation. Then we had questions from Mr. Isaac, a question from Mr. Isaac Chuma, but I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, is about why does the DMCC will provide for efficiency defenses but not the DMA, and Zita's view, that's because the length of time that the EU regulators, perhaps speculatively speaking, not a confirmatory answer, but speculatively speaking, perhaps because of time constraints and because of the reason that in market inquiries may take a long time. Mr. Macaulay Wilson from the Competition Authority of Kenya talked about the possibility of double punishment. If ex post and ex ante regulatory regimes impose the same remedies, but Zita said that both of them can go along, and that risk is kind of diminished because they are meant to be complementary and not really an implementation of those two regimes is not really the intention is not there to kind of impose double, and really there are no mechanisms to do that, to impose double punishments. The other question was from, again, I think Nalini again, about digital markets being global. So how does the DMA apply? To which Zita said the DMA is very jurisdiction specific. It is only meant to be applied to Europe. It is up to, of course, digital competitors. We know that in the privacy space, for instance, many companies, including Google, have kind of applied EU GDPR's obligations and requirements to jurisdictions across the world. And Ms. Shweta about how we can measure the success of an ex-ante regime, which Zita said was a super exciting question. And she also mentioned how the EU has consulted various stakeholders on that question about how do you ascertain success, really. And in her view, market shares would be one way of kind of ascertaining that. If small players market, for instance, in a market dominated by large digital platforms, if a small market player's market share goes up from 2 to 4%, that's a 100% increase. And so that's one way of looking at it, but that cannot be the only sole metric. You have to do a wholesome analysis of market dynamics in digital markets. For example, in markets at nascent or intermediate stage of development, maybe they don't tip because of regulation, or they tip in favor of non-incumbent, non-dominant players. For another thing, new opportunities for non-incumbent and non-established players could also be a very important and serious metric to answer that question. But of course, Zita said that with all that being said, perhaps in some markets, like let's say Google, which is, in search engine market where Google is kind of used all across the world, it's immensely difficult to kind of maybe achieve these outcomes, at least achieve these outcomes, and because of the scale and size of Google and its how it's used across the world. So that's where that's the summary bit.